Hello everyone, my name is Brooklyn Myers and I am an Elixir newbie. My goal is to help people adopt Elixir and grow as developers while doing the same myself. I do that by documenting and sharing my own experience in the Elixir industry. It's been an incredible journey so far and I look forward to taking the next step with you. So let's jump in to the Elixir Newbie Podcast. It was Elixir Conference this week, and this is my first time participating in this conference. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it out to Austin, Texas. There were a lot of people I would have loved to have met there, but I still felt like there was a ton of value attending the online conference. And I'm fairly new to attending tech conferences in general. So in this episode, I'd like to talk about some of my takeaways from Elixir Conf, as well as some of the things I'd recommend if you're planning to attend a tech conference yourself and want to get the most out of it. So when you're thinking about joining a conference, whether you're attending in person or online, I think it's important to keep in mind, what is a conference for? And for me, a conference is about getting excited about new ideas, being exposed to things going on in the community, and less about taking a deep dive into those ideas. There's going to be things during a talk that go right over your head that you kind of miss or misunderstand or don't quite pick up. And that's okay. It's okay to not get everything out of the talk the very first time that you listen to it. The point is to listen to someone else talk about something that they're doing and get excited about the idea. And it's also about interacting with people. If you're in person, obviously this means talking to other people at the conference, talking to the speakers, talking to anyone who would be interesting to talk to. And it's also this great opportunity where you get to interact and engage with the people who are building things that you use or think are really cool. And that one question that you had that you've been having a really hard time finding an answer to, you can suddenly ask the source directly. And you'll also get exposed to things that are not necessarily being thoroughly documented yet, that are new, that are on the edge of what's happening. And for example, I really enjoyed Dave Lucia's talk on Surface UI. And if you don't know, Surface UI is a component library for Elixir and Phoenix, Phoenix being the web framework for Elixir, and Surface UI allows you to use a React or Vue-like syntax for writing little components, components of basically what a UI component. So it's a way of rendering some sort of information onto the screen. It's a way of, for example, a button might be a component, or a select or something like that. And it's a way of having these reusable components that you can use throughout the UI of your application. And it really, in my opinion, improves on some of the syntax in Phoenix and makes it easier to have a component-based UI system, and makes it a lot easier to understand the styles in your application compared to just writing plain templates, massive HTML files, and makes things smaller, more modular, and easier to understand. And when he was talking about Surface, which is already something that I had dived a little bit into, I was already starting to play around with it a little bit in my own personal projects, but he talked about Surface Catalog, which I had no idea even existed. And Surface Catalog is essentially this side library to Surface, which allows you to display all of your reusable components in a catalog, so that if you wanted to build some sort of UI system for your project, wanted to make it easy for people to understand, hey, like what components do you have access to, and to show examples of them, to show if you pass in this particular prop. So if you say, give me a button, and this is going to be a button with a rounded type or something like that, and it has a bunch of different types of buttons that you can render in your project. You can show the customization of the components in your application and how to use them with specific examples. And that's super cool. I've seen similar concepts in other languages, and so seeing that being brought to Elixir is really exciting. And as someone who came from a React background, it's really refreshing to be able to write a component-based system in Elixir, and it feels very familiar. And I feel like I can use all of my existing skills in React and now bring them over to Elixir, whereas previously I was having a bit of a hard time understanding how do I build the front end of my Elixir application in a way that is reusable and understandable. And in the project I'm currently working on, it tended to be just these massive heeks or leaks HTML template files, and just very difficult to understand. Hey, we have this table component, but I kind of just need to copy paste and duplicate this code. And of course, there are ways of doing this in Phoenix with templates, but I personally found that syntax less intuitive. Phoenix is coming out with a new component-based syntax that I'm really excited to try out because I think it might bring some of that value that Surface is bringing and make it easier to make these reusable components in your application. But I haven't gotten the chance to play around with that more, so I can't really speak to it. But anyway, the point being that by attending this talk by Dave Lucia, I got to be exposed to different things in Surface. Afterwards, messaged him and thanked him for the talk, and he actually added me to the Surface channel in the Slack, so got to explore, hey, like there's this Slack channel for talking about Surface, so if you have Surface related questions, you can engage there. And the point being that by attending that talk, got exposed to all these different things in the community that I previously hadn't been aware of, either different libraries or different resources for finding answers to questions. And so by attending these types of conferences, you can be exposed to new things in the community, and that's super exciting. And one of my favorite talks was given by Andy Tran, and I'm really hoping this talk winds up somewhere where I can link it and send people to it, because this talk was about getting involved in the Elixir community, and Andy made this big breakdown of all of the resources in the Elixir community, all of the different places to go for questions, the Slack forum, the organizations responsible for Elixir, and that putting everything into one location where you could get a high-level overview of the Elixir community, that was super value, and I would love to see that resource public somewhere. So right now I can't link it because that talk, I think, is only available through the Elixir Conf replay system, but I'm really hoping that gets put somewhere public, because being able to send people to that and say, hey, like, do you want a high-level overview of the entire Elixir community, all of the different podcasts that are out there, the different blogs, resources, different books, places where you can find information and get help. To see that all in one place was super exciting. Also completely unexpected, the Elixir Newbie podcast made it into that talk, which I nearly spit out my water when I saw. I did not expect to see Elixir Newbie mentioned, since this is a very fresh podcast. I've only been doing episodes for a little while, so really appreciate that Andy took the time to put that on there and share it. That was super exciting. Another talk I really enjoyed was by Max Veitzman, and he talks about how LiveView gives you superpowers, and also related it to his experience getting involved with Bike Brigade. And so Bike Brigade is this volunteer service that pairs cyclists with community organizations. They help deliver food to vulnerable communities, and Max got involved with that project and figured out how he could bring technology into the project in order to better support it. And a big part of the message was, as someone who's in tech, you have these superpowers. You have this power to help serve people, and you can go out and find people in the community who could use someone with your tech knowledge, and find these existing opportunities where people are already serving their community and doing good, and figure out how you can leverage technology for the sake of those people. And talked a bit about the benefits of live view, but for me, the big value from that talk was the perspective of thinking about people over tech and starting from the people perspective. And he created this technology platform for organizing cyclists. And what I found really interesting was some of the decisions that he made along the way in order to support the people getting involved with it, that as someone coming from technology, there's certain things we take for granted. Like, for example, it isn't a mobile app. It's not something that you download onto your phone and then use data in order to interact with. And that, I think, for me would be such a fundamental assumption. Well, I'm a mobile app developer. I build mobile apps, so let's make this a mobile app. But instead chose to use mobile on the web so that anyone could access it. And as a communication tool, chose to use SMS instead of anything that would require mobile data, so that the people using it could just receive a text message with their route and what they had to do, and that allowed them to communicate without the overhead of downloading an app, using some sort of in-app chat service, or going beyond something that they are not necessarily comfortable with. There's no learning curve to texting people, and so coming from that perspective, I think, was a really valuable thing to pull from that talk. So really enjoyed how Max put that together and the overall message of that talk. And if you're interested, I would definitely recommend, especially if you're in the Toronto area, to check out Bike Brigade and see if you can get involved with that somehow, or see and look around your community with how you can get involved with different community programs and how you can leverage tech to help those programs. From the tech side of things at the conference, I know I said at the beginning that the big purpose of a conference is to get exposed to new ideas and to interact with people, but you will obviously attend technical talks and get to have some technical questions answered. And one of the talks that I felt was the most poignant for me was Tyler Young talking about architecting gen servers for testability. And so in Elixir, a gen server is part of the OTP that is underneath Elixir, and Elixir kind of provides. And so OTP is this collection of tools for managing concurrency and real-time features in your application. And so a gen server is this process that you can spin up, and it manages its own internal state, and it provides an interface for interacting with that state. If you're coming from an object-oriented background, it'll feel a lot like a class where you have public, well, I'm going to say methods because that's what would be in a class, but in this case it's public functions, and it works by spinning up this process, and then other processes can send messages to it, and that's how it all interacts. And when you're creating these, you need to think about, well, if this gen server can, for example, behave asynchronously, things can send messages to it, it'll go fire off some fire and forget mechanism, which is to say that it'll go do some action, and you don't care about the return value of that action, and you don't care about when that action finishes. You just need to go and do it. Like, for example, maybe sending off an email as part of your application would be something that you would build using a gen server and a asynchronous fire and forget mechanism where you don't need to wait for that email to finish sending. You can just go ahead and send that email and then continue with the rest of the flow of your application. And you can have gen servers that are singletons, which is to say there's one gen server that does this particular thing in your application, or you can have gen servers that anything can just spin up a new gen server for that particular feature, and you could have 100 gen servers, 1,000 gen servers, all doing something similar. And that's often in Elixir a way of writing concurrent code that, if you have the hardware for it, can run in parallel so that you can do many things simultaneously and take advantage of the built-in concurrency and real-time features that Elixir provides out of the box for you. And when you're doing this, you do need to think about testability, and I found that while I'm starting to get the hang of writing gen servers, testing them was another thing because, for example, if you have a singleton process, so there's one gen server that anything in your application can just send a message to, and it will go in and handle the action that it's supposed to handle. So let's say you have an email sender gen server, and anything can just say, hey, email sender gen server, please send this email for me. Okay, cool, you handle that. I'm going to keep doing my thing. And if you have tests, those tests can often run simultaneously, and now you have test interactions. So you have tests that are interacting with other tests, and you need to figure out, well, how do we deal with that? And to figure out how to do that, Tyler talked about this pattern of making it so that in this particular test instance, it's not a gen server, it's not a singleton, so that in the test you can run it locally, and you're running it with a gen server scoped to that specific test, but in your application, it's going to run as a singleton process. And that was super cool. I've been wondering about how do you test these singleton gen servers. I've been having some issues of getting it to interact. Some of the existing patterns in the community, Tyler talked about how some people will just clear the state of that gen server. So basically, in each test, you're in a single test file, your tests will run synchronously as opposed to asynchronously. So they're not going to run all at the same time. They'll run one in a row. So as long as the gen server is only being tested in one file, what some people will do is they'll just clear the state of the gen server and essentially set it back to its initial value, so that you're using the gen server for one test, clearing the state, using the gen server for another test, clearing the state. And that's how some people get around this problem, but that is potentially problematic. If you do have, if you use that gen server in any other test, that's potentially problematic. It's just not a particularly great pattern. And so making it so that you can treat this singleton gen server as not a singleton was really, really interesting, and a cool way of dealing with that. I also got to attend Tyler Pichal, I hope I'm saying that right, his talk on property-based testing. And property-based testing is something I've been checking out for a while, and this talk just made me even more excited to get into it. So if you don't know, property-based testing is a way of writing tests that doesn't follow the typical example-based testing format. So normally when you're testing something, let's say you have a function, that function takes in a particular input and returns a particular output. For example, let's say that function is supposed to take in a number and multiply that number by 2, just for a simple example. And when you test it, you would give it a couple of example cases and say, well, when it's 1, I expect it to return 2. When it's 2, I expect it to return 4. And that is how most testing in an application occurs. And that's necessarily limited because you're not going to think of every potential use case. You're not going to think of all of the values that would be passed in. And you're not testing the range of values that are being used. You're taking a couple of examples and extrapolating and saying, well, based off of the fact that this function worked correctly with this example, and this example, I'm reasonably confident that it's going to work under all scenarios. And so property-based testing flips that and says, well, let's test based off of this expectation, this kind of contract, which says that like whatever number I'm putting in should be double, and test that with a larger range of values. And so there's some randomization. You're going to run this test basically many times over and run it with a range. So in this case, you could say like from numbers 0 to 100, or randomly generate integers. Often often libraries for property-based testing will have generator functions that let you randomly generate data types, and based off of those randomly generated inputs, it will validate the contract that you've established and ensure that your behavior works correctly. And that's really cool. That's a way of improving your test, and also a way of finding bugs. Tyler talked about how, and I know I've just talked about 2 Tylers, so I hope that's not confusing here, but Tyler talked about how you can actually find bugs that you never expected through property-based testing, because now the range of valid inputs has increased quite a lot. And you may even have, one thing you recommended was you can decide how, I believe it's based off of time. I can't remember if it's based off of time or number of executions, but you can basically make your test more thorough and test more properties, but obviously that has a time cost, because now you're running the test over and over again more times, and so you can run it fewer times locally to make sure that it's working and that your tests stay lightweight, but then run it more times in your CI system. And so when you push the code that you have tested locally, it will run through your pipeline and test against a larger data set. And because the CI is handling it, it's not slowing down your local development, but it's giving you increased confidence that your tests are working. And every time you're pushing the CI, this is running with a randomly generated data set. So over time, you become more and more confident that your code is working. And you can even, because it's non-deterministic, which means that it's different input every time it runs, you can, over time, find a bug that you didn't expect to catch, because there's this one specific edge case that after running thousands of times has finally been executed. And so you get this increased level of thoroughness in your testing by running them in the CI like that. The last talk I want to talk about before jumping into how you can get the most out of a conference and some recommendations that I have for going to one, and some things that maybe I could have done better at this Elixir conference that you can maybe learn from my mistakes, is I really want to talk about Jeffrey Mathias and his talk, Maintainable Test Factories. And so for context, let me just start by saying that I adore Jeffrey, and I'm incredibly biased in talking about how much I enjoy his talks. Jeffrey was my very first entry point into the Elixir community. I wound up attending an online version of an earlier version of the talk that he presented at Elixir Conf for Maintainable Test Factories. Wrote a couple of blogs related to what he talked about and have been learning a ton. Jeffrey is just a very kind person, incredibly open to anyone reaching out and asking questions, and he also co-wrote the Testing Elixir book, which if I haven't already talked about already, I'd be shocked. So this probably isn't new news to anyone, but the Testing Elixir book, which I'll leave in a link in the show notes. I've been really enjoying that book. It's super useful for learning about how to test Elixir and also Phoenix, and talks about how to build maintainable test factories. And so test factories are a way of setting up data for the test in your application. And there are multiple ways of doing that. One of the ways that I used on a previous project is using the code in your application, essentially using fixtures. And I might be using the word fixtures to mean something different than what most people use that word for. So if I'm switching up terminology, I apologize for that. But the way that we used it in a previous project that I was a part of was you would have a fixture that would have this was an object-oriented project, so it would have a method. A fixture was a class that had a method on it that would allow you to replicate the way that a user interacts with your application. And so that approach to setting up data for your test focuses on the behavior of your application and how you got into the state that you need to execute your test. So, for example, you want to make sure that users can see your homepage. So, in order to do that, you need to have them sign in. And so you might have a fixture.signin method on your fixture that does everything it needs to do to set up a user to sign them into your application, and then you can run your actual test and assert that they can view the home page. And what that is good at is making it clear to understand the behavior of your application, but what it's not necessarily good at, that at the time I never thought about, but thanks to Jeffrey's talk, I now think about more, is that it doesn't show you the actual data in your application. it hides it away beneath the behavior, shows you how you got there, but not what state you're actually in. And by using test factories instead of that method, test factories show you the actual data that you're creating. So you create a user, and you would see that in order for them to be logged in, for example, they need some sort of state. Just as an example, they have a state property in the user schema, and that state needs to be logged in. Just as an example, this isn't necessarily how you would actually build that type of system, but showing an example of, you would, instead of calling a sign-in function on your fixture, going back to non-object oriented thinking, instead of calling a sign-in function on your fixture, you would actually insert directly into your database a user with a particular state that you need. And so that reveals the state and data that's important. It acts as documentation for your test and shows other people reading your test, here's how the application works, not how it behaves, but how it actually works. And it does bring some of those implementation details to the surface, which I'm still thinking about. I'm not sure how I feel about it. There's different opinions in the Elixir community. I'm not trying to say, here's the right way to do it, follow this dogma. I'm just thinking about the benefits of one and the benefits of the other. And so the benefit of a factory is that you get to use your data as documentation. And on the project I'm currently working on, I found that to be incredibly useful, because now, in order to understand how the data all relates to each other and how the application actually works, I can read the test and I can see, well, how did we create this in the past, and how do I set this up? And that has been really, really useful. And if you're using a fixture instead of a factory and hiding that away, it can become very difficult when you need to create some sort of customization, or you need to actually get into the implementation details, because all of that has been hidden from you up to this point. So the moment you need to actually interact with it, you don't have anything that helps you with that. You need to really dive into the internals of the code, and I found that that can get very, very messy very quickly. But I also enjoyed the power of being able to just call functions and have everything be taken care of, and not have the additional boilerplate of all this data. And so I'm still not sure my personal preferred method, but at this point I'm just seeking to be able to talk about the benefits of both different methods. And if you're curious about that, I can link a couple of articles in the show notes that are related to that subject. But that was super enjoyable. Really, really enjoyed that talk. Got to ask Jeffrey some questions afterwards. And Jeffrey also has an email for test-related questions as part of talking about these things. So if you do have any test-related questions for Elixir, you can fire him an email there. I'm going to put that into the show notes. So if you're curious about that, I will leave that there. Okay, so I have talked about all of the big takeaways that I got out of Elixir Conference, tried to share them with you in sort of a summarizing and easy to digest way. Of course, I recommend that you go and check all these things out your own, check out some of the other talks. I believe there's plans to put a lot of what was talked about at the Elixir Conference on YouTube eventually, so hopefully it'll all become publicly available, but you can always check out these people individually and see some of the stuff that they're talking about if any of these topics have interested you. And now I'd like to talk about what do I recommend for getting the most out of the conference, what was my experience like from this conference, and what do I think I could do better the next time around. And so for getting the most out of the conference, the benefit of this type of conference, as opposed to just watching a YouTube video, is that you have all of the activity of the community simultaneously on this one topic. Everyone is thinking about Surface right now because there was just a talk about it. And so you can ask questions either as part of the conference or on any of the normal channels I use, like Twitter, or maybe on the forums. And so it's a great time to get involved with the community because there tends to be a lot of activity. And the community can include the person who's actually talking. After you watch a talk, I think it's a great idea to send a message to the speaker either through an @ mention on Twitter if they have Twitter, or maybe a message on LinkedIn if they have that open. For me, just sending a message on Twitter was the most approachable way to do it. So after I saw a talk I really enjoyed, just sending them a message and saying, hey, like, thank you so much for this talk. I learned a lot, really appreciate you going out, and just thank them. I think that it's very easy, if you're not heavily involved in a community, to think that, oh, well, these people, they get this all the time and I'm probably just bothering them, or it's very easy to convince yourself that it's a bad idea to reach out to people, but I think people appreciate it, and pretty much no one other than maybe like Jose Valim and some of the really big figures in Elixir get these messages so frequently that they're just drowning in social media messages. Most people, it's not every day that someone reaches out and thanks them and says, hey, like, thank you for doing this, here's what it meant to me. And so taking that time, I think it'll be appreciated. It's possible it might lead to you getting to chat with that person and forming some sort of relationship, and that's super exciting, but it's also fine if it is just a nice message that you send and they appreciate, and you can call it a day there. That's I think still rewarding in and of itself, and that contributes to this awesome positive community that Elixir has going for it. So if you watch a talk, if there's anything you can do to reach out to the speaker afterwards. One thing I was doing during the conference was making these lightning summaries. So basically taking everything that I had learned, trying to make a super short, rapid fire Twitter thread summarizing everything that I got from the talk. And of course, I missed a ton of information. I was blatantly wrong about a couple of things, which that's great. Like, people pointed that out, and thank you for that. That helps me learn and grow. And that's one of the things that I'm enjoying about this process of learning in public, is when I make a mistake, people kindly point that out, and I would have never known that I made a mistake on something if I just kept that to myself. I would have been operating under a false assumption for who knows how long. So that is one of the benefits of taking everything that you learned and putting it out there. And also, it's really easy after you finish with a talk to just forget about all of it and forget everything that was talked about. And I don't know about you, maybe you have a Sheldon Cooper-esque memory and you remember everything that you watch, but my RAM, my short-term memory, is very, very limited. And so getting that onto my hard drive, as it were, and putting that information and writing it down somewhere, taking notes, that's super valuable. I highly recommend, as you're watching the video, take notes, write down your takeaways, because you're going to get so much more out of it, and then you can go and revisit those notes anytime you want. And that power of having what I have heard referred to as a second brain, basically storing all the information that you pick up somewhere so that you can reference it conveniently, that is a superpower. And you will forget the things that are very easy to remember right now. If you don't already feel that way and have experienced that, you most likely will experience that. It's super easy to forget things. And I found that even tools or things that I used every single day on a previous project, because I'm not interacting with those tools anymore, I've completely forgotten about. So this is kind of a side related topic, but one thing I've started doing at work is every time I'm working on a feature, I start writing about that feature, writing the choices I made, why I made them, keeping this engineering journal, because when I was thinking about past experiences, I actually had a really hard time remembering, what did I even work on? And I remember all these hard challenges and things that I had to do, but that information just gets lost if you're not thinking about it all the time. So bringing that back to applying that to a conference, take notes on the talk, write it down, summarize, take short form. And if you're interested in creating summaries, I think that's a great way to kind of show the speaker, hey, here's everything that you taught me, thanking them, and creating a summary of their talk. I really enjoyed doing that. So I'd highly recommend it if that's something that you would consider. Another thing is to engage as much as you can. So this is related to that topic of asking questions. But one thing I think I could have done better with was I did ask questions during the talk, so that if I had something I was curious about, I can now just ask that person directly, and that was great. But what I didn't do as good a job of was joining the chat rooms afterwards. I didn't take the time to. They had these social events where you could jump into what I think is called it's a software called Toucan, or maybe that's a company name. But that was really cool. It was this way of making it so that people could chat in groups and pop in and out of conversations quite fluidly. And I wish I had taken more advantage of that. I didn't do as much talking to people that I wish I had. So if there's one thing I wish I could have done more of, it's definitely that, getting to chat with people more. And so that's something that I would recommend if you're going to this conference, doing that. Super small thing I'll mention is that if you are considering these types of talks, obviously they can be expensive depending on what your definition of expensive is. For me, Elixir Conference I think was $199. I forget if that's Canadian or US, but I think that's US dollars. And obviously that's a lot of money to spend on a conference. It's totally worth it. And the in-person conference I think was maybe $399. I think it was $200 more. But obviously not everyone feels comfortable spending that money, and it's always worth it investing in yourself, and that money is going to pay back for itself in the future because now you are more capable as a developer, and that will just naturally lead to more opportunities. But of course it's not always easy to do that in the moment. So if you can get support from your company, I spoke with my current company and asked them for budget to do these types of events, and managed to get that going. And that's awesome. It's great because you show your company that you're trying to grow and looking for opportunities to grow as a developer. And you also get financial support so that you can go do those things without paying all of it out of pocket, which I think is great. So if you can get support from your company, if you can get other people involved from your company as well. So when I brought up Elixir Conference, I don't think many of my coworkers were considering going, but by bringing it up and saying, hey, there's this Elixir Conference, sounds like it's going to be really exciting, got other people from my company to attend those talks, and we got to afterwards break them down with each other and talk about the information and kind of our takeaways. And when someone saw a talk that they thought was really cool, that, because there were simultaneous talks going on, I couldn't attend, I could pick their brain about it and see what they learned. Or, if they were really ecstatic about it, then, now I need to go and watch that talk and take some time to do that, because it sounds like this was really impactful. So getting people that you can go to these events with, I think, is really useful, especially if it's in person. There's something daunting about going to an event like this on your own. So if you can have other people there who are kind of this support group, who if you feel uncomfortable talking with people, having some people who are maybe a bit more social or comfortable with that can be really useful for one, kind of warming you up socially and getting chatting and making you feel more comfortable to engage with people. But two, also they can introduce you to people and kind of be a bit of a support network for you. So I think that can be really great. That is going to be it for this episode. I hope you learned a lot about Elixir Conference, got excited about some of the talks that happened. Now you have a bunch of different things that you can check out, and I hope you enjoyed being exposed to some of the things that I picked up at the conference. And I hope that I get to see you at the next one. I'm really hoping that I can start to attend more of these types of events in person. I miss in person. I'm sure we all miss in person. So really wished I could have been a part of this year's conference, but hopefully I will be there at the next one. And if you're there too, always feel free to come say hi. As well as if you want to engage with me online, as always, you can reach me at Brooklyn J. Myers. I'm always open to chatting with people on there. So if you're enjoying this podcast or just want to reach out, feel free to reach out with me on Twitter. Alrighty, hope you all have an excellent week and take care.